All right. Good afternoon or good lunchtime to y'all. My name is Ryan Dawson. I'm a private practitioner in the area. I also teach at Naropa University. I have a psychology class that I teach out there. And I started a gaming group, and this was actually a group designed to bring kids together through the power of video games, because teenage boys are very hard to bring into a group setting. So I started that at the Mental Health Partners several years ago, but I've been in private practice for the last couple of years. And I've also run some groups in the community for young adults and adolescents that are struggling in the relationship to technology, internet, video games, social media, whatnot. I think an important thing for y'all to understand is that I'm a digital immigrant. What that means is that I was born before the internet became widespread. Anybody that's born after, say, 1990s would be considered a digital native, and they've grown up with the internet. It's a fact of life. And many of us who are parents or clinicians in the world have a different relationship and a different viewpoint altogether than the digital natives do. And as a result of being a digital immigrant and having some space from it, it's easier to see, I think, in some ways, the internet from an objective place. I've heard the internet called a great experiment on humankind and in our behavior and how we relate to one another. And really, as a digital native, they see it as integral to their social networking, as face-to-face communication. That's something that I really want to talk about as we go along here. And so I know a lot of people are concerned about the possibility of internet addiction, or is there even such a thing as internet addiction? I will say I do believe there's an internet addiction. I actually wouldn't call it necessarily internet addiction. I believe it's more of an arousal addiction. I'll get more into that in a second. But these are some things that you can look for in yourself, in your spouse, in your children, that might be a sign of internet arousal addiction. So there's carpal tunnel syndrome, finger pain, wrist pain. The finger pain and the wrist pain a lot of times can come from the way that a person uses a video game controller, per se. If they're not on a screen, they can actually, there's a repetitive use that can create finger pain. Dry eyes, blurred vision, and there's also this thing called geriatric eyes, and geriatric refers to older population, and they're finding younger people now with aging eyes, because they're keeping a fixed gaze at a specific distance, and it's actually wearing out the eyes. So, but the dry eyes and blurred vision are symptoms of that, especially if they try to change their visual distance, then the eye doesn't adjust quite as readily. So those are definitely signs to talk about or to look at. Migraines, of course, those are powerful headaches, backaches, shoulder pain. A lot of that comes from postural issues. There's a lot of research now saying that just sitting down for extended periods of time is really bad for us. So getting up, moving around is very important. But the fixed position that a lot of people have when they're interacting with computers, when they're interacting online, creates a kind of backache and shoulder pain. Irregular sleep cycles. This is something that I see very commonly in my practice, especially with the young adults that come in. I typically work as an aside here with teens, young adults, and families. And I have worked with some adults with some internet issues as well. But I see irregular sleep, and especially once they leave the home, they get out into college, they don't have the same checks. Mom and dad aren't checking on them. They tend to get into irregular sleep cycles, and it tends to feed off itself. And I have certain clients that'll try to stay up all day just to get back onto a normal sleep cycle. Poor eating, poor hygiene. This is also very common. Poor eating. There's a kind of a joke out there called gamer fuel, you know, Doritos and Mountain Dew and Cheetos and those kind of things. But that's actually, there's some truth to that. You know, you see a lot of those kind of snack, high calorie, high fat, high saturated fat kind of foods. Poor hygiene. I feel like this is, you know, connected to the social isolation and some of the self-esteem and some of the anxiety that can be produced from excessive internet use. Emotional issues, just talking about a few of those. The depression, you know, there's some studies out there that are linking excessive internet use to increased depression, obsessive compulsive disorder, which is it's in the anxiety cluster of disorders, social anxiety. You know, I see a lot of people isolating themselves, and this to me is like something that's pretty pervasive. And you know, it's a chicken egg thing. I don't know if it's people that have more social anxiety are drawn to increase internet use, or if internet use itself is creating more social anxiety. My guess it's probably a little bit of both. And then ADHD, and this is something that you know, they found a direct correlation with some of the video game stuff that people are playing. First-person shooters encourage a scanning and acting behavior. You know, you're searching the screen and you see something, you act on it, and that actually entrains the brain with an ADHD style behavior. And then avoidance of responsibilities of daily life, and I think this comes from avoidance in general, and some of the arousal addiction that I'm going to talk about in a second contributes to this. But there's a pattern of avoidance, and it starts to get problematic for a lot of people dealing with this. And so why do I call it an arousal addiction? Well, what we know is that there was a UCLA study, and that each time a participant engaged in a new activity while surfing, brain activity rose, and brains were more active when surfing the web. And when people are on the web and they have multiple tabs open, there's a lot of novelty happening, and basically each time that you click on a mouse, it makes a noise. Each time you click on something, it changes. That's telling our brain, our hunter-gatherer brain, that, you know, when we do this, this has an influence on the environment. And there's a subtle dopamine hit. You know, you pull out your phone to check an email, or you get a text, or, you know, all of that stuff feeds dopamine circuits. And what dopamine is a reward circuit. It's evolved to drive us towards natural rewards, you know, food, sex, bonding, accomplishments. And when these are done in the natural world, it doesn't seem to be a problem because it leads us to increases in these activities. But when you have something like the internet, where there's extreme versions of this behavior that can happen, and these things have ability to capture us, you know, what they find with high calorie foods or beautiful mates, that when you give, you know, a rat a high calorie diet, most of them will binge on it, because it's something that's kind of hardwired in us to seek out these extreme forms of a pleasure, of feedback that activates our dopamine system. And in the past, a binge mechanism was an evolutionary advantage. When you found a big stockpile of food, you know, you should eat it, you know, because that's going to help you survive. So to get it while the getting is good. And once again, the rules of the game have changed. And so this is a picture of somebody that's a gamer that's on the verge of what they would call an epic win, but it's in the middle of a dopamine hit. And what's happening there, you see in the picture, there's a circuit, and the dopamine would be those little bubbles between the arrows. And what happens is that the dopamine floods what we call the neurotransmitter, and on the other side, those little cup-shaped stem things are what we call neuroreceptors. You know, and the dopamine comes in, it bonds with the neuroreceptor, it changes the electrical signal in our brain, and dopamine gives us a pleasurable signal. And then there's a kind of, for, you know, shorthand, a vacuum reuptake that happens, and the dopamine gets taken out of the synapse, and we're led back to kind of a neutral state. But what happens is with the tremendous amount of clicks and the tremendous amount of stimulation that's on and novelty that's on the internet, this dopamine receptor is, or the receptors are getting flooded with dopamine, and they fatigue. For, you know, I'm not a brain scientist, but this is kind of my layman's way of explaining it. They fatigue, they wear out, and what you need is more and more dopamine in order to get the same response. And so that increases some of those things that we see: depression, the fatigue, the anxiety, and those are what we think are related to lack of dopamine. Just so you understand dopamine a little more, it's the same things that people have produced in cocaine, methamphetamine, things like that. They really activate our dopamine circuits. So it's something that's it's a natural neurotransmitter, and the internet, video games, social media, texting all seem to play on this. And so this is some of the symptoms of dopamine tolerance. So the pleasure centers in the brain become exhausted, and so there's an increase in the duration of the behavior. So that would be like an increase of time spent on the internet, and an increase in the intensity of behavior. So we're talking more windows open, you know, more intense experiences sought out. We see this, you know, with gaming. You need a more intense kind of gaming. You maybe need more friends on social media. You need more and more stimulation. You need more likes, more. Every time you get a like on Facebook, that's a dopamine hit. You see that craving start to happen. And so to get a little more into the geeky side of this, there's what happens is the excess of dopamine creates a buildup of delta phosphate. And delta phosphate is something that builds up in the circuitry, and that actually leads to brain changes. So they're actually able to see these brain changes in the mammals. And all addictions basically share this process of delta phosphate accumulation. Accumulates in the reward circuit. It leads to cycles of binges and cravings. There's a numbed pleasure response to things in the outside world, and hyperactivity to the stimulus that caused the buildup. And this is important because on the internet, it has many different things on the internet menu to choose from. Some people, the stimulus is going to be the intensity of a video game. Some people will be the intensity of their social network. For some people, it will be the intensity of pornography. And actually, according to a Dutch study, that pornography is the most addictive thing on the internet, and about 40% of the bandwidth going through our internet right now is pornography, just to give you a sense of that. And also there's a willpower erosion that happens as this delta phosphate accumulates. And when we're talking about teenagers, it's especially powerful because they have a brain that's kind of actively forming. You know, young people and teens have this brain that we call is like highly plastic or highly responsive to its environment. And so if it's getting used to an environment with like hyperstimulation, the outside world is going to be a little tough to navigate, because as we know, it's a little more messy, it's a little more clunky, there's less self-control out there. We don't necessarily know what's going to happen, and things kind of unfold in their own kind of quirky, organic way. And if you're used to having a lot of control and a lot of stimulation on the internet, that's a hard world to navigate. And that's something that I'm seeing in my personal practice with a lot of the young men that I see is, you know, a low tolerance to deal with what the world is asking of them. So I hope that is clear. So we'll move into social media a little bit here. And this is just kind of a fun slide of different icons here of the internet. So it's just a pop quiz. There's, you know, think to yourself, what's that on the left? That's Twitter. Twitter has 500 million. Twitter has the average person has 79 Twitter followers. You know, Pinterest or Instagram is something that's actually increasing among the young people. It's owned by Facebook, which is on the right. Facebook has 1.15 billion users, which actually I would say is probably north of that, because these stats change, and they change very quickly. And the median user has 300 friends, and which is kind of absurd when you think about it. We all have large networks, but I don't think anybody would consider 300 friends to be normal. So 700 billion minutes a month are spent on the on Facebook, and 100 billion photos a day are posted. So this is a enormous site. It's one of the biggest sites on the internet, of course. And then you have Tumblr, which is kind of a photo display thing. Google Plus, which is not quite as common. Just to go back to Instagram, there's 130 million people on Instagram, and 16 billion photos have already been uploaded on that. And once again, that's more popular with younger people who are kind of turning away from Facebook. They see Facebook as their parents' kind of social media, or it's a necessary evil kind of thing. There's also things called Yik Yak, which is popular. It's kind of an anonymous posting social media. Tinder, Pinterest, more common among females. They post up hobbies and things like that. Just go to the next slide here. So some of the others, Vine. It's one that's you know, these change so fast. So what's popular and what's emerging. But Vine is something that shows like a 6-second clip of video. LinkedIn, you see that more for like business connections. Once again, that's more, you know, middle-aged people would be using that. And Snapchat, which is gained in popularity. And these are, you know, billion-dollar companies we're talking about here. Snapchat, something that posts an image for just a brief amount of time, and then it gets taken down. What we saw in the kind of early days of that, where people would sext through that, you know, they'd send provocative photos thinking that it would be taken down. And what happened is people would just do a screenshot. They would take an image of their screen, and they would save it, and they would disperse these photos to friends. So it was something that was, you know, thought to be safe way to do that kind of thing. But now it's not. Now actually people on Snapchat can see if people have taken a screen capture of their image. But this is, Snapchat is something that's emerging with the younger generations, as well as Tinder, which is kind of a dating website. It's like kind of a, you know, speed dating thing. You can flash through who's available near you, so it makes dating, I guess, easier. And then Yik Yak, which is an anonymous posting website of people or social media people in your general area. It's more common among college age, and this is one thing that's also starting to come up, is some of these anonymous posting things that have been really linked to a lot of cyberbullying. I think there's one called Secret, if my recollection is right. And that's something that's been used in a lot of kind of like bullying premises, because they don't know who the posters are. All right, so let's see what's the next slide. So this is, you can see this is fall of 2013. And this, I put this slide up here just so you get an idea of just how fast these things change. It used to be for teenagers that Facebook was the most popular, you know, and it's probably still is in terms of sheer numbers, but Twitter's on the rise. Like I said, Instagram is quickly rising. So it just kind of gives you a sense of the transitory nature. And if you see that long other line, you know, teens like to find out who they are, you know, just in general. They, you know, it's one of their developmental tasks is to figure out who the heck am I? And one way to do that is through what social media site are you on, or what game are you playing, or how do you use the internet? So it's important to talk and find out what's happening with what's going on. And so this is, you know, a lot of my slides, because I work a lot with teens and young people, and because the brain is so impressionable of a teenager, that it's kind of easier to see what is happening in the brain. So there's a lot of this stuff comes from studies on teens. So teens who frequently communicate online, there's a decrease in language proficiency. There's a decrease in vocabulary and a decrease in expressiveness. That would be face-to-face kind of body language, personal expressiveness. And if you're not getting the gist, like most of this presentation is kind of on the I would say the shadow side of the internet, or the risks, the dangers. I don't think it's all bad, but I just really want people to understand why it might be important to pick a battle around some of the use that you're seeing, and that it's really important to kind of pay attention to this. Okay, and so why is there a decrease in language proficiency, a decrease in vocabulary, a decrease in expressiveness? And one idea going around is that this is, if you see this slide, is texting, and these are like common like texting lingos. Don't ask me to translate all these. I'm not sure, but it's kind of what Sherry Turkle would talk about. They're talking in sips. And so they're practicing talking this shorthand, which is great if you're just like typing, but it doesn't work well in expanding our vocabularies. It doesn't work well in face-to-face interactions, although you do start to see OMG slide into our vocabulary. I believe it's in the title of this talk even. And so the idea is that, back in the day, that we were going to use the virtual world to build a better world. But what we didn't realize, what would happen when people would start to actually use this at the levels that people are. I mean, it's 95% of people are using the internet in this country. But what Sherry Turkle talks about, sorry to jump around, is that we're starting a society that we're kind of alone together, that people are actually like communicating on their phones when they're next to each other, and they're in the same house. That face-to-face relationships in real time, they're messy, they're demanding, and they include boring bits of talk. And we're not doing that as much. There's not as much of a tolerance. And the other thing is we use our conversations with others to turn around and have conversations with ourselves. One of my favorite quotes is from Plato, as he quoted Socrates, is that the unexamined life is not worth living. And if you just don't have a toolbox to examine your life as other people do, it's harder to examine it. And when you don't have the vocabulary, it directly influences the kind of questions we can ask ourselves. Finding more and more people would rather text than talk. And I will confess, I was scheduled to do this, and actually I just lost my mom yesterday, but I'll say that most of my communications have been through texting. It just feels easier to do in a time when I'm super emotionally vulnerable. And that's something that when we talk about digital media, it tends to influence us and tends to kind of seep into our lives where we feel most vulnerable in terms of like human connection and our sexuality and our questions of identity. This is where technology feels very powerful, feels very safe, but we're starting to see the limitations of it actually. And Sherry Turkle in her TED Talk asks, are we beginning the age of sociable robots? Are we preferring to be isolated, and just kind of going through the motions here? And so, we've gone from an age of connection to one of more isolation, and we're starting to see these side effects, these symptoms of internet and arousal addictions that I talked about earlier. And the other, with this talking and sips things, is that we're not getting real-time external input. So we don't get to learn the lessons of the face-to-face messy communications. We don't get to learn the lessons of body language, of facial expressions, and how to present a better form of ourselves. And a few other things, at least in the academic world, their incoming students are reading less and less. They're maybe reading more and more overall, many different things, but they're having less tolerance for reading. And this is going all the way up into grad schools. One thing that they're talking about is also a phenomenon called Google Brain. And Google Brain is something where, well, we know where to get the information, so actually I don't really need to remember this information. So as a result, people remember more personal stories about themselves and more of their own experience, but they don't remember as many facts out there because they're relying on Google to do that. And it's actually changing the way that educators teach. So they're trying to make things more experiential because, it's not as necessary to get the facts anymore because it's so readily accessible, and the brains of young people are actually adapting to that. And I've found that as an educator, that people just aren't quite as interested in the factual background of things. They're more interested talking about the process. So what else is happening with this this talking in SIPs, this text rather than talk kind of phenomenon that we're seeing, is that our limbic system is not getting exercise as much. And to quote Daniel Goleman here, he talks about there's two roads of communication. There's the high road and the low road. The high road is the all the things that text is great for. Excuse me. It's the facts, the information, you know, just the content. But what the low road information, and which is really, this is like the beauty of human interaction, that's the feeling. That's where we connect with one another. When you tell a story, you're not just picking up the content, but you're picking up the emotional. You're picking up the emotional resonance of it, and like, how does it matter? But if you're just getting the content, you're actually not sharing that low road communication. And you can actually see the limbic system light up when people are in low road communication and resonance. You see a lot of mirroring behaviors happen. If you watch people that are on a successful first date versus an unsuccessful first date, the successful first date, well, there'll be a lot of mirroring behaviors. You know, if somebody touches their face, the other person will touch their face, or, you know, if they look one way, the other person will look one way. You just see a lot of these kind of reciprocal body language mirroring, which happens when the low road communication is activated. And when it's not, you see a lot of discoordinate, uncoordinated social behaviors, and people report less when the low road communication is not happening, when the mirroring is not happening. People report lower satisfactions in that relationship. So when people don't get a chance to practice this face-to-face interaction, you wonder about how they're going to be when they're off to find their mates, when they're off to find their partners. It's going to be a real challenge. And Philip Zimbardo, who was a famous psychologist at Stanford, he talks about the demise of guys, that he's seeing things happen in college campuses where there's a decrease in empathy. You know, there's an increase in narcissism, and they're having a hard time. They're flaming out with women at like, you know, kind of record rates, and they're actually seeing erectile dysfunction in guys in their 20s now that have nothing to do with what's happening below the belt or psychologically, but because of the brain changes that's happening through some of the pornography use. So there's a lot of stuff that's happening, and if we don't have this low road communication and you're not getting satisfying experiences in that, it's hard to make a compelling sell for people to go out and take the risks of engaging in social interactions. All right, we'll take a quick sip of water here. All right, so the online persona, our second selves. So our second selves is something that, it's an interesting phenomenon that's happened, that's kind of come in concert with our online identities. And this is something where people can really find their own unique identity, everything from their handle or their name that they give them to themselves, or the character, the outfit that they create. There's studies that suggest that, you know, people get increased self-esteem from having a second self, you know, that they're proud of, that the second self will have, you know, 300 friends on Facebook, or, you know, I've talked to young women that have over 1,000 friends on Facebook. You know, that they feel more capable, that there's a, you know, they feel like they're socially connected. So these online personas start to become more and more important. And what we're finding is that the online persona actually starts to become more important in people with the internet use addictions, that their online persona becomes more important than their real persona, their real self. And once again, it's easier to manage. It's easier to create a particular kind of image. It's less messy. So, you know, some people are very much drawn to creating that second self. There's some really like tragic examples of it. One was in Korea, where there was a couple that met at an internet cafe, and they played an online game together. They ended up getting married. They had a child, and they were going to this internet cafe, and what happened is that the child starved of malnutrition as they were busy raising their second self's family. They went on the run for a little bit. They got found. They found and they went to court, and they actually it was the first case of like internet addiction. So this can be a very powerful thing, and it's one thing to look out for. Like, how much time are you spending, or is your kid spending on developing their second self, and how much time are they spending developing the real selves in real life? And I would argue that the priority needs to be on the real life self, that the second self can serve the real life self, but the real life self has to have the priority. And this is I have a coaching background in basketball, and I taught swimming for a while, fitness trainer. But so Vince Lombardi here, the harder you work, the harder it is to surrender. And I think this phenomenon happens when you start to look at some of the second selves that people have created, and the amount of time they have put in, thousands and thousands of hours, and the amount of intention and the amount of thought, and that it's hard to give that up. So if you're dealing with it yourself, or you're dealing with somebody else, that it's not going to be an easy thing to give up, because there's so much invested in it. A couple other things just to share about the second self. They're finding that college students or young people are starting to actually have a lot of stress of trying to maintain their second selves. They find it gets away from them a little bit, or trying to maintain the image that has been crafted by their second self. So they're actually increasing anxiety just from that. So like having this like really capable second self may not be all that it appears on the outside. It may not be as good as what they think is happening. So let's transition to gaming here. So this is some of the earliest example of technology serving humans. So this is you see this guy. This is a depiction of Herodotus, and he told this story. And so this is some sheep's knuckle bones and some dice, and some ancient gaming equipment. But 2,500 years ago, that's a PlayStation 4 and Xbox One, or the most modern PC for them. And what was happening was there was a world, or not a world, excuse me. In Lydia, there you see on the little map, there was a famine, and where there was about food for half the population. And so for 18 years, they would take one day where the populace would play games, and half the people would eat, and the next day they would take turns playing games and eating. So you get to eat every other day, and you get to play games on the other day. And they actually found this was able to sustain for 18 years. But after 18 years, they're looking, okay, this doesn't seem to be ending. The famine's going to continue to go. We got to do something about our population. So they kind of did this intentional lemming thing, where the winners of the game got to go on a journey. And so they had to leave. And so basically half the population after this migrated out, and through DNA sampling, they believe that they became the Etruscans who founded ancient Rome. But anyway, just to point like how powerful gaming can be, and how powerful it works on our biochemistry, that if you can survive a famine for 18 years just using some dice and sheep's knuckles, just think of what is happening behind the screens of and in the brains of people that are engaging with the very immersive three-dimensional games of today, and try to think about doing homework or chores in relationship to that. This is a slide that's just to point out that South Korea and China, the mothers in those two countries got together, and they declared internet and gaming as the #1 public health threat, that the addiction. And what they put in place was when people were diagnosed with it, that they would get personal therapy or individual therapy, they would get family therapy, and they would get sent to kind of like a boot camp, where they would go to a detox from the internet and do calisthenics and things like that. Because what they have is a little different. South Korea is actually the most networked country in the world, and that there and in China they have kind of internet gaming cafes, and so it's kind of like a Starbucks where they, it was very common where young people or people using the internet would go and they'd play games there, get on the internet, and so they were starting to see the physical effects of what was happening to the people using this. And because South Korea has blown up this internet experiment larger than anybody, they're actually kind of a model that we can look at to see like what actually does happen with excessive use. And I want to underscore excessive use, because I do not think the internet is all bad. I kind of think about it's like learning to drive a car. It's a huge responsibility, and if you can learn how to use it responsibly, it can be it can really improve your life and give you possibilities you never dreamed of. But also you got to know the risk. You got to, there's no driver's ed for internet use, but maybe there should be. All right, and so who is susceptible? I'm gonna get another glass of water here.
See, you can tell them if they have questions.
All right, and if you have any questions, we have about 25 minutes here. I'm gonna keep running through my slides, but feel free to submit them online into the chat box, and I got my eye on it over there. And if you have a specific question, I'd be happy to answer it. So who is susceptible to the gaming in specific? And some of these are my own thoughts. So those that are disempowered in their real life, and that's and that's something where I see where they haven't had social success, or they're not doing well academically. They don't have a job where they feel good about, or they haven't discovered their role. And what video games do is like they really give them a lot of definition. They can feel really darn good when they're off to slay a dragon with 12 other guys, and that they have a specific role with specific features. And that it's a much more potent use of the hero's journey metaphor than they're able to find in their life. So those struggling socially, academically, those without healthy boundaries, and sometimes this I think because either they're off on their own in college or something after home, or the parents don't really have good tabs on what's happening, but they're spending a lot of time online, and they're not being forced to engage, or being asked to engage in their real life as much. And so they're spending more and more in creating, once again, that second self. So it's not having healthy use boundaries around the internet and video gaming. Those are competitive. Video games appeal to competitive natures. You see them a lot in sports gaming or some of the fighting games, and that the competition can actually be a real hook for people. And once again, that hits that dopamine system, and that they feel very drawn in by that. And then those that are looking for a connection. And that's one thing to think about in social media, is that it's not just the well-established sites like Facebook and whatnot, but also, the PlayStation Network and Xbox Live and Steam and some of these online video gaming things are also where people find their gaming community, and they find their social outlet. They find their friends, especially those that have a hard time meeting friends in real life, and haven't gotten out and don't feel good about the way they look or their social skills. That it's a fine way for them to try to meet other people and develop some of those skills. Although once we talk, with the low road communication, it's not really happening when it's not face to face. Those with the emotional issues, the avoidance issues, gaming is definitely something that appeals to them. This is interesting. Couple interesting facts here. 1 billion bits of data on human behavior every day are getting sent out to the gaming. So they're recording that, and what they're doing with that 1 billion bits of data, they're looking for like the hooks in a game, and what is the most sticky part of the game, and where do gamers turn off, and where do they turn on, what keeps them going, what keeps them coming back. You see this with a lot of things like a Candy Crush, which was a big on the App Store, where it's like they're able to update it. It's a free game, but what they find out is just how to keep you on it. And then if they can keep you on it, then hopefully you can start downloading stuff, or they can advertise. So they're trying to keep you on it. They're trying to make it an integral, necessary part of your life, or as you see it, by using that dopamine system. So they're trying to find out what frequencies, what colors, what activities activate that dopamine system, and how do they put more into the game. So they're not necessarily looking at the health of the person interacting with it. They're trying to, I think, create a fun experience, a sticky experience, and but there's not a lot of long-range thought about what this might be doing to the brains of people that are engaging with this all the time. They also have, once I get sophisticated reinforcement schedules. Everything you do, you get reinforced with, whether it's a click or not, but it's also variable, so you don't know if it's going to pay off. They can keep you, some people opening boxes, for hours at a time, just so you get that one prize. Like I like to say, Vegas doesn't have anything on these guys. I believe it's an $84 billion industry, which is bigger than recorded music. I think network television or something put together, and so they have the best and the brightest going there, and they're trying to create these games that really hook people. And of the games that seem to be the most addictive or the most appealing in that way, and I think it's because they operate on all the levels that I have here on the slide, are MMORPGs, massively multiplayer online role-playing games. So this is like World of Warcraft, League of Legends, StarCraft, and then if you're in South Korea and you're playing these games, you could be an A-list celebrity. You date supermodels, red carpet treatment everywhere you go. We don't really have that in our culture. But people, in the U.S., actually, there's a increase of these tournaments where people go, and they're starting to sell at Staples Center now, where people just go to watch other people play games. And if some of you out there have kids, you probably see your kid just watching other people play games. It's its own culture, and it's very powerful. And what they're saying is they get about 3 billion hours a week on these MMORPGs, just on World of Warcraft here, and over 6 million years of collective human time have been put into World of Warcraft, which is kind of mind-boggling when you think about it. So your average gamer is going to have 10,000 hours personally put into gaming by the time they're 21, which is the same amount of hours that people put in from 5th grade to graduation in school. And if you're familiar with Malcolm Gladwell, he wrote a book called Outliers, and in that book he talks about that the people that were most proficient, the Beatles, the people that, were the great artists, the great scientists, they put in about 10,000 hours. That was kind of his magic number. So there are people out there thinking about how do we use all these expert gamers to help move the world forward. But it's also, it has its emotional and psychological side effects. Okay, it looks like we have a couple questions. Okay, so what do I consider excessive use? That's a really good question. So the American Association of Pediatrics talks about, as a kid, no more than for young children, 2 hours of screen time total in a day. So I think as a parent, it's important to think about screen time, and not just, it's the iPad or the computer or the TV or the phone, but how much are they interacting with a screen? And actually, it's also important to distinguish, is it rapt attention, which is where somebody's like interacting with the screen, or is it passive attention? And those do very different things with the neurochemistry, where, TV, if you're just watching TV, that's kind of a passive activity, where rapt attention actually is a little more sticky for people's brains, and it seems to activate them and light them up even more than just watching TV would. But the AARP recommends 2 hours a day. And, as, many high schools are going on, using iPads, 100% or becoming online, like there has to be access. So just to make sure that, your teen has enough time to be using that, but watch what differentiate between the leisure use, the gaming use, and the actual like studying use. Okay, so there's a question: how do we pull our kids away from this? It seems to have such a strong pull and create such conflict within our family. Of course, yeah, that's where I talk about picking the battle. It's easier the younger you start to get into the habits. And you know what? I'm going to address a lot of this stuff as the next 15 minutes here. And so this is some of the reasons what we're seeing happen is that back there used to be limits to the level of interaction we could have with the game. You know, so there was limits to the fun. Is you needed a quarter. The games were less complex. People were standing around doing these things together in arcades, or people would all be hanging out the house with the neighborhood Nintendo or Atari. But there used to be kind of limits to that. But now the accessibility, and I think this is like a picture that really depicts it well. You see a little girl with her mobile gaming device, which nowadays has her social network. It has everything on it, you know, everything from an iPad Touch to Nintendo. So it's like you can play it in bed, you know, maybe they hide it under the sheets. You know, about 44% of people sleep with their cell phones. Their cell phone's also something to think about, falls into this. And so this is kind of a humorous depiction of like the nightmare scenario of kids that are, you know, South Park, obviously, of kids that have excessive use of the internet. And just to kind of tie this up with a story, because I think stories are good to remember as we're doing these things, is that when I was working as a counselor for kids with disabilities, we started this wrestling program, and this is kind of what the kids would look at. They had spina bifida, cerebral palsy, so they weren't as mobile as this typically, but you know, it was a fun wrestling thing. But you know, year after year they would come back to me and like talk about, you know, what are we going to do this year? And each year we'd kind of like level it up and hype it up a little more and let them pretend like, you know, they're a part of something bigger. And what I found was that in their reality, they thought they were doing something like this. And I think video games really appeal to this sense of grandiosity and power and, you know, kind of heroic things that young people are looking for in their life. They're looking to feel impactful. They're looking to find things in their life where they feel empowered. And, you know, when I was doing this wrestling thing, it just as kind of like a byproduct that it seemed to be that this was happening. But I see this more and more in my conversations with people online, that it's where they feel like this. They feel empowered. They feel like they have an audience. They can go on YouTube and they have, how many followers do you have? You know, it feeds a sense of importance. And so as you're thinking about it as an individual, it's like, how do you increase your importance in real life? And how do you increase the power and the importance that your kid feels in real life through activities that actually will benefit them? And so talk about cyberbullying here. And I see I got about 13 minutes, so this is going to go kind of quick here. My apologies. Let's see here. So some of the rates here, it's so 16.3% here is the average of lifetime cyberbullying offenders. You know, so there's about 16% of young people are cyberbullying, and about 24% have been bullied. So the good news, or if it's good news, that less people are bullies than are bullying. But cyberbullying is related to lower self-esteem, suicidal ideation, anger, frustration, and a variety of other emotional, psychological problems. There's been, suicides, teen suicides attributed to it. You're seeing it closely tied in with sexting, that a young lady or young man will send out a provocative picture of themselves, and it gets disseminated to their peer group, to people that were not intended recipients of it, and it can be a real issue. Where avoidance of school, avoidance of peer groups can lead to substance abuse, things like that. So when it's happening, it's really impactful. It's a real problem. And the anonymity that's online is actually something that's, I think, also impactful. I remember in my social psychology class in undergrad, talked about in the Vietnam War that the combatants with face paint actually created worse war crimes than those that could be seen. So this anonymity piece, and this, some of these things like yik yak and secret, like there's it can be really brutal and really vicious. And it's something to keep if you notice a change of behavior of your teen or something like that, to like really like ask about these kind of things, because 24%, that's a quarter. That's a significant percentage. Young women are more at risk to this, but it's definitely something that we see. And there's blackmailing that happens through photos. And they say up to 35% have experienced some form of cyberbullying in their life. Facebook depression, is it real? So there's more research going on what's happening when people interact with Facebook, and they're finding that people that spent more time on Facebook were actually starting to have more increased signs of depression. Once again, it's hard to really pinpoint these things, but what they did seem to find is that people that kind of did more of a voyeuristic way of going through Facebook, looking at other people's photos, and not really contributing themselves, not feeding, or like bringing out themselves into it, seem to feel worse about themselves, increasing jealousy, envy, and lowering of self-esteem if they spend a lot of time looking at other people's lives. Because once again, these second selves tend to be the best parts of ourselves, but our real selves are comparing ourselves to these second selves, and that's where it can kind of get real problematic. Because deep down we know we're not our second self. So if we're seeing somebody else's second self, but it's still our personal self that's relating to that. Girls are more likely to dislike their body and weight with increased exposure of ideals of beauty and fitness, which you see a lot on the social media. 1 in 3 felt worse after visiting a site, more likely to eat unhealthy food. One German university reported rampant envy. So parents can keep an eye on use and moods. That's important. So, and of yourself, because I know there's a lot of adults out there too that are using Facebook and perhaps don't feel better about themselves when they're done with it. So maybe look at how you're using it and what role that it's taking in your life. Watching other people's vacation photos, that's actually been that's been shown to decrease our satisfaction in our own life. So, just something to think about. So sexting. So once again, there's legal issues now with sexting. 6% these are reported of teens that have sent a sext, and 15% have reported receiving a sext. It goes hand in hand with the cyberbullying, and that excuse me. That this is, once again, this is being used to blackmail people, and it's becoming more and more common for people to explore their sexuality online. Their avatars sometimes are gender neutral or have an opposite gender, so it's like our second selves can have this. Or if you're sexting, they're finding teens think of it more of like this is kind of just how you do sexuality in adolescence, is that you're going to send a sext at some point. So once again, the digital natives think differently about this. It doesn't seem as foreign to them. And of course, if you pay attention in the news, there was this whole incident with the iCloud break-in. So it's like there's no security online with any of this. And it's hard to talk about the sexting without also talking about pornography, but I feel like that's a whole nother hour talk. But just know that that's rampant, and that it's also like seems to be the most addictive piece of the internet for young men especially. And I think there's a good talk from Gary Wilson on a TED Talk if you want to look more into that. It's a Glasgow TED Talk, TEDx, Gary Wilson, if you want to look that up. So privacy, and once again, this is the digital footprint. This is something when I've given talks at schools, this is one thing I really highlight, is because anything from 13 on, employers and colleges can go back and vet. They can look and see what people are doing, and they're good at digging. So if there's 2 equal applicants to college, more and more schools, more and more, are looking at, okay, so let's find photos of them. Is there a beer in it? Is there, a bong? And what is there some kind of compromising position? So they're trying to get an idea of the character of the individual through their digital footprint. And I think it's actually better called a digital tattoo, because it's not going away. I mean, they have warehouses the sizes of city blocks just to store information. And when I was talking to one guy that actually did this for a college, he was at a college in Boston. He talks about teens just need to know that all this stuff is out there and it's very easy to find, and that his job has been to kind of just track people's second selves and what are they doing, and where have they come from. And anything post 13, which is kind of when Facebook lets you use it. So to really like limit the early uses of that, and to know that anything that gets put out there can, Facebook owns, and it can easily be audited or subpoenaed to be brought into evidence for whatever. So, and teens post a lot of content online. They put their information, the schools they go to, like first, last names, home addresses, like all these things pop online. They don't have the brakes in their brain to inhibit behavior that adults do. So they're not always thinking about that. My nephew, he did an experiment where he put up a picture of somebody that looked kind of like gloomy and threatening, and he like basically asked to friend everybody in his network, and he said most people friended this fake individual. So it's like a lot of teens aren't discriminating about who they let into their network either. So to really talk about the privacy, and to vet some of these people, like if you're gonna like talk with your teens about this, I think it's really important to be transparent with how you're going to do it. Are you going to read their emails? Are you going to look at their friend list, that you don't like kind of surprise them with it? Like be in relationship with them. I kind of call it like the digital zoo. You go to the zoo with a kid, with a young, and you look at the hippopotamuses or hippopotami, I guess, and the rhinos, and you see what's going on there. Same thing with the online world. Like, what is the pornography they're looking at? What is the content of the game? Are the images and the ideas that they're getting from these things, how you see the world? Is it a helpful way to see people like that? Is that actually the real world? And so it's another image of the digital footprint. But to navigate, to go in there, and it takes a lot of courage to do that as a parent. And teens aren't going to readily let you in there, but to be transparent with what you're going to do with the information and why it's so important. And so I hope that some of this talk is going to serve as motivation to kind of go a little deeper into that world with your teens in a relational way, though, not to like overlord it with them typically, but to talk about it and to get real and to see what their online world looks like. So these are just all the different ways that the digital footprint is getting put out there. Got just a few minutes. So these are kind of some tips. Take technology fast, unplug, if it's a weekend, that's great. Beware of media multitasking. They find a decrease in understanding, a decrease in efficiency. I've seen kids that were straight A kids come into my practice that grades started suffering because they got caught up texting a lot. So it has nothing to do with their cognition, but their attention gets diverted. And so you go from a laser to this broad spotlight. So make sure that, if they're doing homework, just let them have what it takes to do the homework, because they're not going to be very good at regulating it themselves, because it's their social world is right there. Try to teach them how to amplify the good in real life, and how to get those good nuggets, and to spend quality time with one another, to get out in nature. They find just, images of nature help to relax the brain. And be intentional in that relaxation. Like getting online is not relaxing. Video games are not relaxing. TV is not relaxing. Actually relaxing, taking time just to breathe, to be there, to meditate, to pick up something where your neurobiology can take some time, and you're not getting these constant dopamine hits. And that's where unplugging and is really helpful. And role modeling this, like a lot of us are caught up in our own cycles of this. To have balance in life, to between sports or, healthy activities, physical activities, and, make sure the nutrition is good, the academics are focused, that the social network is there, that they get to have some time online where they get to explore their identities, but to know where and how they're doing that. And so this is a slide here. Let me see what else. Setting limits. Be willing to set and enforce boundaries. Expect to have conflict as part of the process, because the ground that the kids have gained, they're not going to give up readily a day. Once the AAP suggests screen time 2 hours a day, the average 8-year-old's getting about 8 hours. of screen time a day. So probably they're getting more than that, but the expectation or the recommendation is much lower. Younger child, less screen time allowed. You know, so and some people recommend not even before 6. Just don't let them play games. Don't let them do that kind of thing before 6 years old. Know where your kid is going online. You know, kids are poor self-regulators, so help them set the limits and know the healthy boundaries. Role model technology limits. Keep electronics out of the bedroom if possible. That's a big thing because once again, the accessibility. It's like putting an ice cream machine in a kid that's struggling with their weight, or it's hard not to use it. And respect their privacy because it's part of them learning responsibility. But stick to your end of the agreement. So thank you for listening. Thank you for watching. If you have any further questions or you want to talk with me, you can contact me. I offer a free 30-minute consult. Thank you very much.